Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel. Welcome back to Company of Heroes 2 for Company of Heroes 2 in Retrospective. This is going to be our sort of little review sort of thing that we're going to be doing now that I've sort of gone through all the factions. I'm still going to play the game, but I think this is an appropriate time to be doing this, especially since a really big update to Total War is coming out and I want to get in on that. But anyway, let's start off by telling you what this is about and what it's not about. This is going to be about the multiplayer experience. It's not about the campaign, and the reason for this is that I just wasn't all that interested in trying the campaign, so you can think of that as a negative review. I think mostly it has to do with the fact that I'm just sort of not in the mood for a sort of very scripted RTS experience right now. I like them occasionally, but mostly only when they come out from Blizzard. For the most part, I usually prefer playing multiplayer when I play RTSs, or I prefer ones that allow me to play a grand campaign style sort of thing, which this one really doesn't. So anyway, let's get talking about the RTS elements here. Now, as a strategy game, this game doesn't have necessarily the same categories that I was marking the other games on, that sort of idea of the story or the characters or anything like that. That just doesn't really happen to the same degree in an RTS. We can talk a little bit about the characters, and that will be part of the review, but if the categories seem dramatically different, that's because this is a different genre of game, and that sort of requires that difference in view. So anyway, let's talk about those characters for a bit. When you're talking about an RTS like this, the characters are the closest thing that you've got to that are the factions, and in this particular case, if you've got the basic game, you've got the Germans and you've got the Soviets, and it's a little bit peculiar in how they've gone about it, in that they've decided to go with the idealized Germans from sort of public perception of them that a lot of people have, that they've got the invincible badass tanks, that they've got the soldiers that are better than everybody else's and all that other stuff. The reality is a lot more complex than that, and so is the reality of like the idea that the Soviets had very inferior everything. Simply put, neither of those views is very true, so the way they've gone and interpreted it is not necessarily historically accurate or very flattering to either side there, but it works out well enough for a game, so it's not like this is a history lesson, so it works out okay. The fact that it's sort of very Hollywood and the fact that everything sort of moves as is works out well for a game like that. I mean, if it was perfectly historically accurate, what you'd end up with is the Soviets would have 10 T-34s for every single Panther that the Germans could field, and would have like 3 of the T-34s for every Panzer IV that the Germans could field, and the Panzer IV would be invincible compared to the Panzer IV would be incapable of damaging the T-34. So it wouldn't be a fun game for the German player, because, spoiler alert, the Soviets beat the Germans in the war quite convincingly just by outproducing the ever-loving hell out of them with things that were not, strictly speaking, inferior was the worst part. So if they had produced tanks that were actually as bad as they're sort of depicted in Company of Heroes 2, even a 10-to-1 ratio, they may very well have lost. I mean, they're pretty bad in this game. So anyway, talking about the other factions, if you've bought the expansion, it adds the United States and it adds another German faction. And this is where I've got a bit of a problem with their choice in characters. It made sort of sense. Eastern Front, you've got these sort of Hollywoodish armies, and then you've added the Americans who are kind of that, but then you've just simply added another German faction. I think this was a chance for them to have done something much more interesting as far as that goes. They could have, for example, looked at North Africa, and they could have gone with the Italian army, led by Rommel, because Rommel did actually lead a significant number of Italians rather than Germans in his particular force. And they could have gone for that angle, and they could have included, say, Patton's force in North Africa, which came in after Montgomery or something. I think that's how it went. I'm pretty positive that's how it went, but they could have gone for something along those particular lines rather than simply going for another generic German faction and a nondescript American faction. And you know, if they had gone the British angle, they could have gone for a Pacific Theater update, which could have brought in the United States Marine Corps and the Japanese Imperial Army, which I think would have allowed for the most variety and the most sort of different views. But instead, they've basically just decided that the Axis powers only consisted of the Germans, which I think is a real big mistake, because they weren't the only faction there, and honestly, they weren't the most interesting of the armies there, as idealized as they have become over history, because let's face it, if you build up a villain to be bigger than they really were, they become a bigger accomplishment when they get beaten. And I think that to a large degree the Americans sort of want the not just the Americans, actually, all of the Allied forces want the Germans during World War II to be this big, scary, invincible boogeyman so that they can say that they beat that invincible thing. But even as early as 1941, the great leaders of the Allied powers said that the defeat of the German army was inevitable. It was just not in the cards that they could even try to win at that point in time. It just wasn't going to happen. And they ended up being right for a lot of very accurate reasons, such as the collapsing industrial resources that were required in Germany. They just simply could not access those resources, and there was no way that they could break through to get them, and so on and so forth. So ends up being that we're seeing factions being a little bit idealized on the German side. I think that getting rid of that notion so that they can incorporate other elements like the Italians and like the Austrians, maybe like the Japanese, that would definitely make the game more varied and more interesting and open up more opportunities for different factions to have different elements and different design decisions. So moving on from that, let's talk about other elements that are combined with this sort of genre and other genres. So let's talk about the appearance and the aesthetics of the game. I actually really like the way that Company of Heroes 2 looks. Everything sort of looks bright and vibrant at the start of games, and usually a lot of games it'll remain like that. The colors look good, the textures look quite good for an RTS. Keep in mind that, like, if you zoom in ultra close in a strategy game, that's not really how the game's meant to be viewed, so it's going to look a little bit worse when you zoom in too much, but it's designed to look good from a top-down angle from quite far away, and it doesn't actually look that bad when you zoom in either, so it's not that bad a game as far as that goes. But what I really like are the destruction engine components of this game. The way that craters open up, the way that buildings take damage from explosives, the way that all those sort of giant bombs just make a big impact on the battlefield, and you can see it very visibly what happens when an area is getting shelled. All that sort of stuff together I think is really well done. It looks really good. The visuals on that are excellent. I think that as well, all of the units look very distinct. If you've played enough of the game and you sort of recognize them anyway, you can sort of tell what units are which just by looking at them, but if you're looking at a big group of infantry, it's easy to tell what they are at a glance because they've got those nice icons. The icons that they've chosen are very clear as to what you're looking at once you've sort of gotten used to the game. Obviously, if you don't know what the icons represent, you're not going to have an easy time with that, but once you understood what the different icons actually mean, it becomes very easy to tell what's going on, and it becomes very visually easy to understand through a very visually busy game, because it can get very busy with all the units that end up on the field, all the tanks that end up on there. Just by looking at those icons, it becomes very simple to tell what's going on. So I think that the visual choices, for the most part, were all very excellent. There are a few visual glitches wherein, like, units move very strangely. Their legs sort of don't move and they kind of glide across the battlefield, or you'll end up with dead people who are just sort of standing stiff like boards straight up. And those can be immersion-breaking moments, but I think it's, for the most part, pretty forgivable. They're pretty isolated. Well, they happen fairly frequently, but you don't necessarily notice them unless you're looking for them, and if you do happen to catch a glimpse of it, yeah, it can be a little bit immersion-breaking, but it's nothing too bad, because you'll usually be too busy microing other units or working other units to make that really count for anything. So, all in all, it's a pretty good-looking game. It works well for what it is. I do like the fact that they chose to start off with very bright, vibrant colors and a nice-looking palette as far as the world goes, because it does turn into a very brown game once the shells come down. Although, I mean, there's no way you could do a game like this without turning it brown once the shells come down, because everything just turns to sort of dirt and mud and awful. But anyway, moving on from that, let's talk a little bit about the sound. Now, the music in this game is not all that inspiring to me. I don't often listen to it. I actually listen to a different soundtrack, usually while I'm playing this game. But it's atmospheric enough, and it fits the sort of themes of the game. It's a little bit peculiar when you've got that sort of very Russian chorus-themed song, and you're playing as the Americans, and there just are no Russians on the field. So it's a little bit peculiar when that happens. It would have been nice if they added some additional soundtracks for replacing that when you're playing as a different faction. As well, they've tried to make it so that dramatic music comes in and plays when you're in a moment where there's a big battle or something like that. But the scripting for that doesn't seem to be working quite right, because sometimes it'll start winding up that song, and you're just going to end up not quite engaging the enemy, so it's just this sort of weird out-of-place music, and it can often sort of be a little bit jarring, which is a little bit awkward. The other sound assets, though, are quite excellent. I really like the way the guns sound and the way the explosions sound. All of that sounds quite good. You can often distinctly tell what kind of gun is firing simply from the sound of it, and that works out quite well. The unit barks, on the other hand, I'm not necessarily a fan of. There are quite a lot of them. They become quite busy, and they can become a little bit distracting when you're trying to listen for something. For example, if something happens while someone says, gives a grenade warning, it can get a little bit confusing as to what's going on. And as well, if you're throwing a grenade at about the same time your opponent's throwing a grenade, they've got this weird thing where your unit will respond to their own grenades as though they've been attacked by one of the enemy ones. Because I think the way it works is they will yell grenade if they're in proximity to one. So if they threw one, they're now in proximity to one, so they'll yell that. I wish that didn't happen in this game, because it can get a little bit awkward and a little bit auditorially busy, and when you need to use those sound cues for so many things in this game, which you do, it can get really out of hand there pretty quickly. So I think that's probably the weakest part of the sound assets. The music, you know, there's nothing strictly speaking wrong with it. It's background music, it fits in the background, it's not that intrusive. I just happen to prefer listening to something like Daft Punk or something like that while I'm playing these games. So, anyway, let's move on to the actual gameplay elements, because those are sort of key in a game like this. So, let's first off talk about what this game is and is not. This is not a competitive game. Okay, you could not take this and play it at the highest competitive level because there are too many elements in it that prevent the most skilled player from acting consistently. There are luck elements in this game, and that's okay in a game like Total War, where you've got 1,000 people per side, and the statistics of that just means that on average, you're going to end up with the same results no matter how many times you run that. The actual little bits that occur from random generation don't actually matter all that much. That's not true in Company of Heroes, because instead of a clash between, say, 1,000 people all at once, because typically you start with your entire army, you're going to end up with this weird clash at the early skirmishing phase where it's just like, okay, well, will my Sturm Pioneers make it to that line in time to kill all of those riflemen, or will his riflemen kill like 2 or 3 of my guys all of a sudden and then kill the other 2 while I hit retreat? That can happen, and that's a difficult call to make. Now, admittedly, a perfectly skilled player may be able to juke out of line of sight to try and go for a flank, and if they're against a perfectly skilled American player, it ends up turning to nothing, as neither side can really do anything there. But even then, let's say that you just sort of get a glimpse of one another, the rifleman can still snap off a couple of shots and one-shot one of the Volk's Sturm Pioneers. And if that happens, that's a huge blow if he decides to sort of pursue a fight there, because even at close range, 5 riflemen can kill 3 Sturm Pioneers. So it becomes the sort of game where luck can make a very big impact on, especially in those early game skirmishes where it can dictate the rest of the game to a very large degree, and that control and who gets to tech up faster, and all of those other nice things. So the fact that this game is very luck-driven, especially with things like penetrating hits and with critical hits against vehicles and mortar strikes, there are a lot of luck elements to this game. So I think that sort of diminishes the competitive aspect of it, and if you're a very competitive gamer, a lot of those elements will irritate you. Now, this game still is okay as a competitive game. The superior player will usually win, but he has to be superior to a broad degree before he'll consistently win, because all those luck things can still come into play against him, and all of those other elements can definitely diminish the experience. So if you wanted an experience that was purely skill-based, this isn't really it. Moving on from that, let's talk a little bit about the micromanagement. This is not really a casual RTS game. I don't think I actually know of any RTSs that are truly casual, but this game in particular seems to require a ton of micromanagement. This isn't so bad in this game because there's very little economic management that you have to deal with. In fact, there's none other than occasionally, like every minute or so, spend money. So The micromanagement in this game, though, is quite intensive, and you do have to constantly be watching units that are going to be fairly spread out across the map. So if you're looking for a more relaxed, laid-back RTS experience, this one isn't it either. So you end up in this bizarre situation where this game isn't for the hardcore, competitive StarCraft players, and it's not for the ultra-casual players. I think that the reason I like this is that I had actually gotten into first rank diamond in StarCraft, and I was actually beating and playing against Masters level players. But it's just too stressful. Like, StarCraft is ultra competitive, it is way more stressful than Company of Heroes 2 is. So I think what it boils down to is, if you've already got the micromanagement skills, but you want an easier experience than StarCraft's, this works out pretty well for you. I think that sort of micromanagement level, because you don't have to deal with buildings, is pretty easy to deal with, so it ends up being a fairly casual experience for someone who's not, who has a lot of experience in the genre. If you don't have any experience in the genre at all, this is going to be a fairly frustrating great game for you, as you constantly get pegged by just grenades that wipe out entire squads and stuff like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of the game. The economy of this game is one that I actually like for the most part. I'm a little bit conflicted on one thing, but for most elements I really like the way they've gone about it. So the way this game works is you passively generate income by capturing points, and you generate fuel and munitions by doing so. And this causes both players to immediately play more aggressively than they would necessarily play in another one, because you have to go out and you have to control those points to gain your economy, which means that there are going to be minor duels and skirmishes throughout the early game. And this solves the problem that you sometimes see in RTS games, where the only early game action that you'll see is if one player is rushing, and sometimes maybe if they're harassing with a scout. This sort of really solves that issue, in that you'll end up seeing little bits of micromanagement and little bits of fighting early game. And since they're not focusing you on your economy, this makes it easier to swallow that sort of micromanagement element of just, you've got maybe 3 riflemen, try to do the best that you can with them. I think that works out very well. That sort of dynamic action early game is just a lot more interesting than you see in other games, sort of in the early games. So the only resource that does not follow this pattern is manpower. The way manpower works is, if you're ahead and you have way more troops in the field, you get very little manpower income. And manpower is required to build literally everything in this game, other than, of course, upgrades. But if you want to get a new unit of any sort, you need to spend manpower, and it's usually going to be your key resource to winning the game, preserving that manpower and spending it wisely. If you're playing as somebody who's going to be way behind, or if you happen to be way behind, you get more manpower income, and this can actually let a player who's way behind get back into the game. So it's a bit of a recovery mechanic. Now, in RTSs, typically there are no great recovery mechanics. Once you're way behind, you end up staying way behind, and your opponent just ends up wiping you off the board. In this game, they can actually make a bit of a comeback, and I do think that's a good thing to have sort of a way for the player who's a little bit behind to come back, especially in a game like Company of Heroes 2, because there are certain factions which are really powerful in the early game, and if you happen to be against one of them, it's a matter of surviving for the late game. And if you can't come back into the late game, then you're going to be in trouble. So the fact that they've added in that sort of release valve, letting players a little bit behind, or quite a bit behind, sort of get back into the game a little bit, isn't quite good. On the other hand, you do want the person who is ahead to have an advantage, and you do want them to be able to shut that opponent down if they're dominating badly enough. And the way they've done this is that they've tied munitions and fuel to that. And munitions and fuel are used for higher tech units, for upgrades, stuff like that. So if you have a lot of munitions and a lot of fuel, your units are going to be vastly superior to your opponents, even if they have more manpower and can start catching up in terms of numbers. You'll start pulling ahead in terms of quality and armor and stuff like that. And that can be decisive in and of itself. So the way they've done it is that if you're behind, you're not 100% screwed. If you use your manpower wisely, you can sort of push back out, you can make a comeback, you can capture some of the points, and you can start getting those tech units back. But if you are just camping in your base, you're just using that manpower income to try and hope that you can come out with a huge wave of infantry all of a sudden, you're going to be behind, because you're going to run those units out and you're going to run into tanks, and it's just not going to end well for you. So the way they've done this, I like the resource balance in this particular game. I think that was a particularly well thought out source. I disliked it a little bit more in Company of Heroes, the original one, because if you fell behind, it just sort of rolled back completely, and since even then the factions were not necessarily all balanced in the early game, they were sort of balanced for different phases of the game, you could end up with games where one person just fell way behind and could never recover. Now, other than the resources, the mechanics of this game are mostly about sort of maneuvering your units and having them sort of fight out from cover towards the enemy. If you've got something like a tanker, of course, obviously you're going to play it very differently than you would play infantry, but for the most part, it's about that sort of management, moving your troops into cover, trying to hug walls, trying to pin down enemy infantry so that you can hit them with artillery, stuff like that. It's fairly basic stuff. Should all be fairly intuitive, and I think that sort of intuitive nature of a lot of the things that goes on as far as that goes is pretty good. Some of the stuff that you'll see is kind of weird, like flak 37 flak cannon penetrating the armor of a IS-2, but honestly that's rare enough that it just doesn't really matter all that much. So all in all, the base mechanics of using cover for your infantry to keep them alive, using explosives and machine guns to sort of cause kill zones on your opponent, all of that I think works out pretty well and is fairly functional and logical, so I do like the way that works. The way that some of the anti-tank stuff works is a little bit janky because of the way that tanks go. A lot of the time you'll end up seeing tanks dancing around behind an anti-tank gun. That's a little bit bullshit in the way that works. It might be a little bit better if there was some means of dealing with that, but that honestly is a minor complaint. You can deal with that with better positioning with your anti-tank weaponry and stuff like that, so not a huge concern. Anyway, lastly, let's talk about faction balance, and this is, I think, a big thing to talk about in a game like this. They made a deliberate design choice when they made this game on how the balance was going to go that I don't necessarily agree with. For the most part, you see that the Germans have a lot of access to anti-tank weaponry. Their infantry, for example, have those very, very powerful Panzerschrecks. They get 2 in a package for a Panzer Grenadier squad. They've got really great anti-tank tanks. For example, the Panther is an amazing tank hunting tank. The other tanks that they've got, the Panzer IV, is very good against tanks. But the Soviets, they decided, would not have access to anything like that. It would have made more sense to me if they gave them the Lend-Lease bazookas, because they had Lend-Lease bazookas. In fact, the bazooka that they stole off the Russians was what inspired the Panzerschreck. But they haven't done... But they hadn't done that. They've instead decided that the Soviet forces will not have any easy ways to deal with tanks. And so they end up in a situation where they have to rely on this very expensive, very high tier, very awkward to use Su-85 for a lot of their anti-tank operations, or they have to use the very static, very lame Zis gun, which I think I call it lame because it just is so easy to overrun the Zis. It's just not a great weapon for dealing with enemy tanks unless you can somehow ward them off. Ultimately, the best Soviet weapon against tanks is landmines, and I think that's just too awkward and random to use and too easy to counter for that to be really even considered, all things considered there. So I do think that that design decision was a bit of a poor one. Now, all in all, the Soviets are still able to deal with tanks. It's just that they require a lot more effort to do so, and I don't think that was a very well thought out decision. Similarly, if you're playing as the Germans, it can get a little bit out of hand dealing with the Russian infantry, and if you want to have a slightly easier time dealing with Russian infantry, you end up sacrificing way too many of your fuel points into anti-infantry tanks, which do very poorly against their tanks. So it ends up being a fairly balanced game, but it ends up being very frustrating. If the Russians end up with enough of an infantry lead and they've got a few vehicles to support their infantry, the Germans are going to have a very, very difficult, frustrating time if they get pushed back early too badly and they can never tech up. And that's sort of my strategy when I'm playing as the Soviets, is to push the German back so hard that he can't really tech up effectively. He needs to get like half tracks or whatever just so that he can try and push out and try and reclaim some territory so he can get those fuel points. But if he does that, then he's spending that fuel. So if I retake the fuel point and I destroy that half track, then he's just screwed. Similarly, if you're playing as the Germans and you just sort of hang in there and you keep your fuel points and you boost up your fuel production to the point where you've got a couple Panzer IVs and maybe a Panther, there's not a whole lot in Soviet arsenal that can now stop you, especially if you get 2 Panzer IVs, you can take out an Su-85 very easily. All you have to do is flank it. So you end up in this situation where the balance makes the game frustrating if you end up out of your element, and it's very easy for your opponent to try and focus on that. The new factions, I think, work out better as far as that goes. Despite the Soviets and the standard Germans being balanced against one another, the Oberkommando and the Americans don't feel frustrating to play against one another. The Americans can deal with both armor and infantry very effectively. Their drawback, their biggest strength is their versatility and their speed. Their biggest drawback is their fragility. Their units are very fragile. By contrast, the Oberkommando can deal with infantry, and they can deal with tanks very well. They're very good at dealing with both. Their weakness is that their units are very expensive, so neither of those factions really has any problem dealing with anything, and their weakness that you're trying to exploit isn't necessarily going to be one that's very easy to exploit. I mean, obviously you want to hit the American tanks with weapons, that's how it goes. Obviously you want to kill the expensive Oberkommando units, but it never feels frustrating when that sort of thing happens to you, because you've always got the tools to deal with that and react to that at any given time. By contrast to the Soviets, where if it's the late game, you often feel like you don't have the tools to deal with that heavy German armor. Or if you're the Germans in the early game, you don't feel necessarily like you're equipped to deal with some of the Soviet bullshit that can happen with their, for example, shock troops. So they're very, very different experiences playing as the Americans and the Oberkommando. And at the same time, while they feel less frustrating, they also feel more powerful, which I think is a very big problem. Now, I hope that Relic isn't going to do this, but they have a track record of doing it to a certain degree, and that is that they start introducing more and more powerful units and armies as time goes on. You can already see it through the way they've got the doctrines set up. A lot of doctrines are outright more powerful than others, and they're often locked behind paywalls, so you have to pay to win to a certain degree. Now, they're not actually so broken that you automatically win the games if you take them, but some of them are definitely unbalanced compared to the others, and especially like the ones that provide unique units that are very, very powerful. The Tiger Ace from the Elite Troop Doctrine, for example, is that doctrine was just very poorly thought out all in all. It gives you, for example, elite units right off the bat that can just dominate the game, and then eventually you get a Tiger Ace. And the problem I have with the Tiger Ace is that you can't stop it because it's pure manpower. You don't have to pay fuel for it. If you had to pay like 270 fuel or something for it, which is about what you pay for a Tiger, I'd be okay with it. But instead they've made it cost 800 manpower, which is only about 60 more manpower than a Tiger is for the Oberkommando. So, you know, very poorly thought out doctrine, that one. Anyway, all in all though, the game is a pretty interesting one. It's fun to play. It's not necessarily one that I think would work if you want to get into a very serious competitive RTS experience, but it's a fairly fun game, and it's interesting to learn how to play it. And a lot of new situations come up, and a lot of new matchups happen based on sort of how your opponent decides to build. The game is still being supported, so all in all, it's been a pretty fun game so far. I would try and get in early if you're interested to it, because Relic does have a track record of ruining games as they produce more and more DLC. So it's likely that once they've gotten a couple expansions out their way, if they end up producing too many of them, they'll probably unbalance it to the point where it's unplayable. So if what I've said so far makes it sound interesting to you and you want to try it out, now's the time to do so. Check it out if you want to. Anyway, I hope you found this video informative, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.
They have only 75 points remaining.